Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be back. I have a great fondness for North Carolina. 22 years ago, I actually spent the summer in North Carolina, and it was a transformative experience for me. There's been a lot of talk here about innovation ecosystems. And what does that mean? What I'd like to do is to propose a way of looking at this. As Alir mentioned, I'm an entrepreneur and an investor in Silicon Valley, so I actually live and breathe these ecosystems all the time. And then we're involved in building these ecosystems around the world. So what I'd like to do is to try to shift your thinking a bit. We had a tremendous discussion earlier where we saw Rob Atkinson and John Allison talk about this bifurcation between a world of freedom and a world of public investment and resources. And that's kind of a bifurcation that's overtaken American political life. I'd like to propose a different way of looking at the problem, which relates to this issue of civic life and the way we engage with each other in communities. We talk about this as a new economic paradigm, and I refer to this as from Silicon Valley with love, because in some ways we're stuck in this paradigm as it exists today. We're stuck on one side of the door, and we're really trying to figure out how do we get through that door to a world that looks mysterious, that rainforest on the other side that's unpredictable. So how do we get there? So let's try to walk through that door together during this lunch hour and try to understand where we're going. So this is a question that's been a conundrum for a long time. What makes Silicon Valley tick? And we saw some of that data earlier that showed that North Carolina was actually doing very well in the 90s. And Silicon Valley, however, seems to keep regenerating itself. How do we replicate that fundamental ecosystem? Not necessarily what you see on the surface. I'm not talking about dating apps, per se. I'm talking about what is it about that system that keeps regenerating itself year in and year out, generation after generation. So these are some of the obvious things people look at. These are the actual companies that probably may be in your pocket today, or you maybe spent some money on them today, unwillingly. But I'm not really talking about that. We're not talking today about the Apples, the Twitters, the Facebooks, and the Googles, or even the Ubers and the Airbnbs. We're trying to get beyond that. We want to look even deeper. At its deeper question, I want to start with a can opener. So this is the butterfly can opener, invented originally some prototype, some version in the 1870s, and then it evolved over time where they added a handle, they made a serrated edge, and it became easier and easier to use about a century ago. And this is the can opener that we know today, increasingly. Now that other can opener, this can opener, do we like using this? No, we hate it, right? Why? It hurts, right? It's kind of hard to turn. And what happened over time is people said, starting in the 80s and the 90s, people said, we can design this better. We can actually design these to fit real people. Because it's not just, soldiers in the battlefield using these can openers. These are moms and children and people whose hands may not be so callous. They actually want something easy to use. So design allowed us to think about the interaction of our objects with human beings. How we interrelate to things that are useful to us is the principle of design. Same thing about buildings. So we've actually looked at buildings, and buildings have gone through a similar transformation. So this is a building. Some of you might recognize this. This is City Hall in Boston. And this won a ton of awards around 1970. This was called the pinnacle of modernist architecture. It won many grand accolades. People called it the school of brutalism because it's got that sense of brutal strength. And what does this building speak to you, if it could say something? Keep out. Keep out. It's a strength, confidence. We know what we're doing. We are the city. We run this place. And this was a lot of belief in the primacy of human reason and the ability to actually control our environments. We had conquered chaos. We had conquered scarcity. We knew how, as a society, to run it. The problem with modernism and the problem with this belief in rational, quantifiable ways to run a society was this. So this is, if you pan out a bit, this is Boston City Hall. And what's the problem? Well, people are really, really tiny next to this. And if you ever spent some time in front of that City Hall building, you'll know that. It's actually not a pleasant building to be around. It's huge, it's imposing, and you don't feel very relevant. So people are little ants next to these monolithic architectures. And so what's happened since then? Well, buildings have become more friendly. We think of new architecture today, it's actually quite accessible because of design, because we've thought about how does it relate to human beings as individuals. You can't just make a building in abstraction. You have to make a building in relation to how the people move around it. how the environment shapes their behaviors and interactions to do things with each other that are useful. The same thing applies to cities. So when Robert Moses was thinking about the future of New York, what would be the most efficient way to move resources around? If you think of neoclassical economics as a factor economy where the whole point of economic productivity is to move stuff around really efficiently. Well, the best way is just to build a giant freeway to move stuff around. So we cleared out the coastline. East Riverside Drive, FDR Drive as it used to be called, is like this freeway to move things around efficiently. Now, those of you that have actually been on that freeway know it doesn't work so well in practice. In theory, though, that's the point. The point is to move things around efficiently because that's good for society. But again, this is the problem. So you have a great freeway, you can move things around, but where's the beach? Where's the coastline? Where do you take your dog for a walk? Where do you play with your kids? And seeing this massive movement back now these days. Hong Kong, for instance, has a similar thing, and they're actually rebuilding now a waterfront in front of their coastal freeway. The city of Buffalo is doing the same thing. There's a lot of cities around the world that said, what happened to that human scale? What happened to the ability to create a society that we can live in and interact with? And so there's a movement of how do you design a city so people can live in it and can do things in it that they enjoy doing. So this is what I call the evolution of design thinking as a whole, which is the shift in thinking about things from abstract concepts into things that actually relate to our lives and how we use them. So objects, it's called industrial design. With buildings, we call it architectural design. And with cities, we call it urban design. But what is it about ecosystems? Can we actually create ecosystem design? Can we actually design our economies the way that have conscious interaction with the way people interact with their ecosystem? This is a big challenge, but it's the next step because there's so much sense that our economies are detached from our individual lives today. Don't you feel anonymous in economic life for the most part? I think that's the human condition today. The problem with ecosystem design is that ecosystems are invisible. Unlike these other things where you can see them, you can see a can opener, you can play with a can opener, you can see a building, you can see a freeway. You can't see an ecosystem. So how do we architect an invisible infrastructure as opposed to a visible one? If we know that invisible infrastructure causes economic wealth to be created, what does that look like? The idea I'd like to propose to you is that biological systems are the same principles that underlie all living systems. This is from a noted economist, but it's very true. You're seeing increasingly the sense of awareness that biological systems are, in fact, human life. We are biological creatures. We've got the same foibles, and despite our rational minds, we make all sorts of mistakes, and we're driven by emotions just as much as other creatures. And to understand this in full, let's step back in time. If you think about our economy today and how we run our businesses today, they're essentially a result of the industrial mindset. The industrial mindset was, well, you take the factors of production, you take the inputs into a system, and you control it as tightly as you can. So if you're trying to build airplanes in World War II, as this picture shows, you're trying to control that process of making sure things are built the way you want them to be built. And the same thing would apply not just in tangible goods, but also in intangible goods. Whether you're programming or whether you're doing phone banking, you control. So you control what time a worker comes in, you clock them when they go out, you even have a spreadsheet that calculates how often to go to the bathroom. You got everything down to the most precise detail. This is industrialism. This is mass scale and replication of how we build useful things. It's neither good nor bad, it's just what happened. It's also similar to a farm. So on a farm, you know what you want to grow. You want to build a crop, and your goal is to make as much of that crop as cheaply as you can. You want to replicate it, and the ways you do that, you'll actually add fertilizer, you'll irrigate, you'll control that as much as possible to create that crop, because that's how you make money. You grow as much of that crop as you possibly can, as efficiently as possible. And if you have a weed on a farm, what do you do with the weed? Well, you kill it. You don't want weeds. You might even spray some Roundup in advance to get rid of it, but you'll do everything you can to keep weeds from growing. The unexpected crops, weeds, you don't want. Now let's contrast this with a rainforest. So in a rainforest, what's a weed? Well, everything's a weed. Everything's unexpected. Things are changing all the time. That newest little plant popping up today could, in fact, be the most valuable crop in the entire forest. You just don't know because it's still a weed. So everything looks the same in the beginning. And This is the challenge, because when you're trying to look at things like companies in Silicon Valley as they emerge, what was Uber 2 years ago? Was that a crop that someone had designed in advance? Or was it a weed that sprouted up in the system, that evolved as it grew? Or you think of all these companies that have grown up in the valley. These were weeds. And so much of our life, and business life and economic life, has thought about innovation as crop production, as building things that we plan. But instead, it's about building things that we can't plan and nurturing the environments. And how do you nurture the growth of weeds? Well, it's not by deciding to plant lots of seeds for weeds. It's the environment. So it's the soil, it's the nutrients in the soil, it's the humidity, it's the interactions of the things inside the forest itself. So you build rainforests not by planting more trees, but by nurturing the environment that causes new trees to grow. And so you run into this paradox, which is, if you look at this iPhone, for instance, crops are harvested most efficiently on farms, but weeds sprout best in rainforests. So this iPhone, for instance, it's produced at scale, right? You wouldn't want someone on the assembly line making this one day to decide to say, I'm going to be creative today. I want to make this iPhone a little different. I'm going to exercise my originality. You wouldn't want that, because you want your iPhone to work exactly the way it wants. But when you're sitting down, you're actually designing the next operating system for the iPhone or the next iPhone, what do? Well, you don't know. The team at Apple right now, I'm sure, is working on the next generation, and they have no plan what that crop is going to be. So it's a paradox. We have rainforests, and we also have farms. So this paradox, this interesting dichotomy, goes to this point that Silicon Valley is actually not a place at all. It's actually a state of mind. And this is a state of mind that I would argue has been hard for most regions of the world to capture, because they've thought of it as an issue of things and places and visible things, as opposed to the invisible things that are in our minds. So if we want to build these types of dynamic ecosystems, we have to create states of mind. There's no choice. This is the way it is. And let me explain what this means. So let's break down states of mind. Let's try to really understand how that works in practice. So all ideas grow from weeds into crops. They all start as unexpected things, and eventually they scale and replicate as crops, as things that you can predict and grow. So we've come up with 7 rules of the rainforest. We've developed kind of a social contract in the valley, which just popped up on its own. This is a set of rules of human behavior, of how people interact with each other in civic life and in business life. It's all the same, to create innovative things. So 1, you break rules and dream. That is, you're not bound by precedent. You're just always trying something different, even if it hadn't been done before, especially if it hadn't been done before. And you see this all the time. There's lots of experiments, lots of weeds being grown. 2, you open doors and listen. You never know if that next billionaire is a college dropout wearing a hoodie, right? Or in Steve Jobs' case, that really smelly hippie dude that's really hard to deal with. You just never know, right? That's the way innovation happens. You have to be very open-minded. And you find that the venture capital industry in the Valley, they're pretty open-minded to a lot of things that a traditional banker might overlook. They're open to dropouts, and they're open to smelly people. In the banking world, they're more averse to those things. Trust and be trusted. You give trust first before you receive it back. And this is very interesting, because when you talk to most people in business, they'll say, well, I trust people I've worked with before, or I've known before, or they have a deep, long track record. In the Valley, you find people extend trust first, in general, before they get it back. They just take a leap with people. And you ask, well, don't you lose a lot of money? Well, I've talked to a colleague of mine who's been in venture capital for 25 years, and he said, in my whole career, my trust was violated twice, but I made money on everything else. So in the end, it works out. Number 4, you seek fairness, not advantage. In the beginning, when you're building things, you try to be fair, like a little team of people, of friends trying to create something, or a group of strangers working on a problem. You try to be fair. You're not trying to win. You're not trying to take advantage of anybody. In the beginning, all things start in communities of fairness. 5, you experiment and iterate together. You're always trying to build. And you err, fail, and persist. You're making mistakes, you're trying, and you keep on going. You don't give up. Now let's contrast this on the other side with crops. The rules of the plantation or farming, these are the rules for production. I'll go through these a little bit faster. Excel at your job. Excellence is number 1. 2, be loyal to your team. 3, work with those you can depend on. 4, seek a competitive edge. 5, do the job right the first time. 6, strive for perfection. And 7, return favors. Now, do any of those look objectionable? They're not. They're actually, though, the opposite of the rules of the rainforest. You look at them paired up, they actually go in opposite directions. On the left-hand side, they pull you towards unpredictability. On the right-hand side, they pull you towards predictability. But they're the same. They're actually opposite ends of a spectrum. They're behavioral rules. And if you remember, a lot of the books on business in the 1980s were those ideas on the right-hand side. A lot of the books today on business actually are the left-hand side. We've moved from a production-focused economy over a couple decades into an innovation economy. But it's essentially a choice of behaviors along a spectrum. Let's make it even easier. That's a lot of information to absorb, and I've spent some time on this. But if we go even deeper, let's make it very easy. Let's reduce each of those rules into single words. So those same rules now can be reduced to these words: openness, diversity, serendipity, fairness, experimentation, play, and giving. And the rules of production can be reduced to these words: excellence, loyalty, dependability, success, quality, precision, and reciprocity. Again, they're opposites. They're paired up, and they pull in opposite directions. Now, if I just started this talk and said Silicon Valley was all about that stuff on the right-hand side, you would have said, yeah, that sounds pretty good. But here's the thing. All ideas start on the left, and if they can't make it to the right, they die. And all institutions that stay on the right and can't reinvent themselves on the left, they die as well. It's that process of moving back and forth that actually causes innovation to happen. So let's try to map this out, right? There's some of you rationalists in there that says, well, does he have a graph? So I have a graph. I will explain to you in very close detail how this works, in quantitative rigor. So value creation on one side and time on the other, as ideas turn into products at scale. This is how all things happen, how all businesses are built. So on one side, you have cost. So cost drives down. This is well documented. This is the consulting industry for the last 50 years. This is called the learning curve or the experience curve, as folks at Boston Consulting or Bain Consulting might tell you. And on the other side, you have the innovation curve, the benefit of something. Benefit, innovation grows as well. These are all S-curves. And S-curves come out of biology, but they're also replicated in business. There's a lot of data that shows this is how businesses run. So you have benefit and cost, fighting against each other. So here's the interesting thing. If you divide it up and you realize that one side is an innovation mindset and the other side is a production mindset, you start to see what happens. Because ideas start on the left side where your cost is higher than your benefit, and they have to go to the right side where your benefit presumably can get higher than your cost. But the behaviors are very different. On the cost side, you have zero-sum behavior, competitive behavior, me against you, company against company, fighting for finite resources. On the other side, on the benefit side, on the innovation side, you have positive-sum behavior, helping, sharing, people growing. And so this political bifurcation you see between people that believe in a world where we help each other and we give freely, and there's altruism that's everywhere, to worlds where you have to be highly competitive. It's a false bifurcation. It's a spectrum that we all live on. And all of us have predilections to certain parts of the spectrum. But what the Silicon Valley experiment shows is that it's all together. It's all just one thing. So some tools to build these environments, this crossover point in the middle. That point in the middle is the hardest to get across. It's a chasm. They're tools to build effective, diverse connections between people. One, you learn by doing. So people don't learn things by being told what to do. They actually just do it. They get engaged and they start building together. Two, they enhance diversity. You're trying to build interactions between people that normally don't get to interact very well, particularly among strangers. This is a very hard thing to do because our instinct is to reject strangers that are very different from us. That's human nature. But innovation requires us to break through those boundaries, to break through those really difficult barriers. Three, you celebrate role models and peer interaction. All innovation happens among peers, following the ideas, being inspired by others. So how do you replicate that process? How do you create role models that people can follow and peers that interact in many creative ways? Number four, you build tribes of trust. You build teams where people trust each other and they know how to work together in tight groups. All innovation happens in those types of communities. Five, you create social feedback loops where people understand the rules of behavior within systems. They understand where that comes from. They understand what happens if you don't follow the rules, and they understand what happens if you do follow the rules. And you make social contracts explicit. It's hard to follow the law when you don't know what it is. So we found in communities, instead of just saying, well, the culture emerges organically on its own, you actually start to state the rules. And this is no different than corporations that put their mottos and their rules on the wall, right? They're actually making their social contracts explicit. They're saying where on that spectrum they want to fall. Because part of human nature and part of the human condition is that we're separated. Humans are actually very lonely creatures. Even though all of you are here today and made a great effort to reach out, how much of what you really know in life, all your experiences, all your passions, all your dreams, are actually shared with other people? Very, very little. We're constrained. Human beings, by and large, are very separated. You always go to sleep alone. But trust lowers these barriers. It allows the free flow of ideas. And there's a lot of scientific research that talks about how people solve problems together. And trust, communication, high levels of connectivity and information sharing actually causes problem solving to be better than if you assign experts to solve problems. So where we see walls today, you can bust them apart. So people get more connected with each other. And this is what we mean by ecosystems. In ecosystems, the barriers for human interaction, the transaction costs, as economists would say, are lower because we can build together, we can create together faster because there's less restricting us. So this new paradigm looks like this if you want to compare the two. So in an old model, you try to control production, but instead we say today that teams create together. Instead of clustering, just trying to shove a bunch of people next to each other, you say it's about human connectivity. Instead of saying that we never fail, we focus on failing fast and cheaply. Instead of inputs and outputs, the factors, if you will, of an economy, we talk about reducing social barriers. Instead of planning outcomes, we look at experimenting, adapting, and iterating. And perhaps most importantly, instead of saying that economic life is morality neutral, we say that values actually matter. In fact, culture is a lever for economic growth. That's a revolutionary thing. It's quite radical to say, but it's actually true. I'll give you an analogy back to biology again. So some of you have probably been to the Redwood Forest out in California. And there's an interesting paradox in the redwoods as well. So if you look at the top of the redwood trees, they're fighting for finite resources. There's only so much sunlight that trees can fight over. They're always fighting each other. They're always killing each other as they're crowding each other out for sunlight. That's competition at the very top. It's cruel. Sometimes trees will seed a bunch of other trees, and the children will kill the parent tree. That's just the way nature works. But there's an interesting thing that happens too, which is that redwood roots are very, very shallow. They only go down about 6 to 10 feet, despite trees that go up hundreds and hundreds of feet. Their roots interlock, because if they didn't interlock, they would fall down when the winds blow. So at the very base, where things start, there's deep levels of cooperation. There's deep levels of interlocking and mutual behavior. It's positive sum. They have to interlock, otherwise the trees fall down. But as they grow, as they sprout up, they compete to death. So this interesting paradox is not just in human life, it's also in nature itself. How do we create societies where the roots interlock, yet we also are very happy or content with letting people compete to succeed at the very top? So one of the questions people ask is, well, that's great in theory, but how do you do in real life? Well, here's an example. This is a classroom at Stanford. This is a class that's been taught for almost 30 years. Now, does this look like a farm or a rainforest to you? It's messy, right? It's a mess. So you see all these things I'm talking about. You have teams that are very diverse. You have people that are from industry. You have academics. You have students from different walks of life, creative people, engineers. They're all working on problems. They're working on a real-world problem. These are actually corporations that sponsor these design teams, these design engineering teams, to build prototypes, to solve problems, like real industrial problems. You see rules on the wall. Throughout this room, there are rules of here's how you behave within the system. You see prototypes. There's actually things on the ceiling that are actually models built from the year before to show people it's possible. You can build these things as well. And so these teams even hire a therapist because they realize the psychological breakdowns from diverse teams cause them to fail. In fact, 65% of startups fail because of team issues. This is documented research. So they've learned that the human interactions and the way people deal with each other is critical to the innovation process. And this class runs throughout an entire school year. They're building stuff. They're building these by shaping the environment in which they're building. They actually cause better innovation to emerge. This classroom is shaping the environment of the behavior that causes innovation. And it's not just in a classroom. We do this at a conference we run. So this is our conference. It's actually next week on innovation. We have 50 countries that are all looking at building these ecosystems. And we create these environments where we replicate that design innovative process, focused on human behavior and how teams form and how people interact with each other. And we do this not just through table work, but we actually create the entire environment around them. Because you find that everybody's got something creative inside them. You just have to create the mindset. So we create states of mind in a conference like this. And it's not just us. This is what designers are doing around the world in corporate environments, in business environments, in economic environments to cause innovation to happen. And you can do it in cities. This is a project we worked on. We did this in Colombia, where we helped design models to actually shape the ecosystem within Bogota. And we've done this in companies. That logo's a little off, but this is a company I started called Liquidity. And we've invented a bottle for instantaneous purified drinking water. You can actually scoop water from a river and instantly drink it, and it's guaranteed bacteria-free. This is technology that's been years and years in the making, but it's a company I started, and today we're actually launching this product in just a few weeks. Extremely hard, but it's the same principles at work, which is bringing very, very diverse people together to solve a common problem. It's very hard, but that's how innovative things happen. And you can look at countries. So this is a new book we just published called the Rainforest Scorecard, which is a methodology following a lot of corporate processes for how you scale innovative thinking across vast, vast organizational networks, whether it's a community or even a country or a company. And this is free, available for download on our website. We've issued this via Creative Commons license, so anybody in the world can use it and riff off of it and remix it. So I'm going to summarize everything I've said today with this, because it's a lot of information to absorb, and hopefully it was useful to you. But how do you summarize the rainforest in just 3 words? Well, I'll propose these 3 words. 1, fear. Fear is a dominant characteristic in human life. People are afraid to try things out. They're afraid to take risks. They're afraid to break the patterns from yesterday. Fear dominates. In fact, fear is a better motivator than any other motivator in human life. You overcome fear, though, through trust. If you trust your environment, if you trust the people you're working with, if you trust the things you're working on, you overcome your fear. That's how we do it. As human beings, we trust each other to overcome the fear of doing something. So how do you create more trust? Well, love. Love is actually the way we build. Because when you're giving of yourself to something greater, whether you're giving yourself to a team or a cause or a mission, that's why we do stuff. And in fact, innovation, if you look at the work on Silicon Valley, you look at the history of Steve Jobs, you look at the history of Mark Zuckerberg, they didn't do this because they'd rationally decided it would make a lot of money. They did this stuff because they loved it. They loved creating stuff that was useful to people. They loved building things. The company that's developed this water bottle, it's the people wanted to build this. They loved building this thing. And so love, not in a silly, fuzzy sense, but in a deep, profound sense of doing stuff that's meaningful to you and sharing common purposes together is actually what drives the innovation process at its deepest core. So maybe 3 words is too much for you. Let me reduce it to 1 single phrase. Because we talked about the economy feeling very anonymous today and how it's hard to feel empowered in such a difficult environment. Well, the rainforest really is about this. It's that you matter. You as an individual can start something today that can transform all of civilization as we know it. There was one day at Stanford not that long ago when Larry and Sergey met up at student orientation because they were assigned together, and they ended up starting a company. You never know if that conversation at a coffee shop or whatever could become that little interaction that causes a transformation across the entire system. Each individual shapes the nature of the system. It's not just an anonymous economic system. And so this is you. It's me. It's all of us. We're all weeds. We're all just trying to push the cracks of that sidewalk that's been laid on top of us. And so it sounds daunting, but that's all it is. It's just pushing through. And we tend to be more afraid than we really need to be. So thank you very much for your time. And I would just offer this, which is that in the end, just remember that silly things like love and trust and paying it forward to others, they actually are the things that in the end drive the world. Thank you very much.